All right, welcome back. Hopefully you made it through that sort of painful video on Flexbox. I know it's a little tedious. You don't have to be an expert on it, but know that some of those classes are going to come up. And I'm going to give you an example of why you should care about it. In this video, we're going to talk about navs, which are a little bit different. They're pretty similar, but the syntax has changed a little bit from Bootstrap 3. But what's new is that they're built with Flexbox behind the scenes, which means that we can actually move elements around using the Flexbox utilities we just learned. So just to prove it, I guess, you can go back to the same document I've been referencing over and over. It says rewrote component with Flexbox. And then in addition, there's a couple of changes to the actual markup. You now use separate classes. In the past, you just made a single nav class, and then you had to do LIs with anchor tags inside. If you didn't have an anchor tag inside of an LI, the CSS wouldn't work for Bootstrap. Now, instead of enforcing that structure, you have to use additional classes: nav, nav item, and nav link. But what I want to show you is that we also can use the Flex utilities to move things around. First, let's just copy over a default nav. So this is just a simple nav. I have a new document, of course, and I'm going to put this nav right in there just to give you a tour of the markup itself. We have a UL with the class of nav, but it does not have to be a UL. It could be a nav element, which I'll also show you. Inside of that, we have a nav item, and then inside of that, an anchor tag with the class of nav link, and we can make one of them active if we want, or one of them disabled. This is what it looks like. So there's actually a note on this on the web page. Active in the normal nav isn't going to alter the look. As you can see right here, the base nav component does not include any active state. But later on, there are other types of navs like tabs. So if you make something active on a tab nav, it looks like that. Or pills, the active element looks like this. Anyway, that's not really the point here. If we also scroll down further, you can see there's another nav, and this one's even simpler. It's just a nav with a class of nav, and then anchor tags using nav link. So there's no UL, there's no LIs. Instead, it's a nav and anchor tags. So we can copy this one over just to show you that they both work, and they're both navs, and they look identical. So you have more flexibility now, but you have to use a couple of classes in the past that you didn't. If we compare it to Bootstrap 3, all that you had to do in Bootstrap 3 was pretty simple. Nav, and then you put LIs with anchor tags inside of them. But you didn't have to add classes to those LIs or to the anchor tags. Okay, so now the sort of fun part. By default, is it default? Default? I never know which one is the correct sort of inflection on it. I know one of them is a verb, like defaulting on a loan, default version, whatever. Anyway, so what I want to talk about here is Flexbox and where it comes into play. So remember that it said navs are now built with Flexbox. What that actually means is that they automatically have display set to flex. So to prove that, let's take a look at one of them. And I'll full screen this to give us some more space. Let's look at this second nav right here. See that its display is set to flex. So without it, all of those LIs end up going onto their own lines. Here, because we have display set to flex, that doesn't happen. But what's cool is that we can use those utilities we've already been working with. So if you look at the nav, it goes all the way across. If I added a border to it, which I totally could do, let me shrink this back down. Let's work with this, let's do the first nav, why not? So this one here, I'm gonna give it a border, and the default gray is pretty hard to see on a screencast, so let's do border primary. Okay, so this is the nav. Now we have all those utilities that we can use to space things out. So these items inside of there right now are at the start, because by default, everything in Flexbox is a row. This is a row, and it's not a reversed row going from right to left. It's going from left to right. If you watched the last video, we talked about that. So I can use the class, let's say justify content end if I wanted to. And notice I don't have to say display flex or deflex because it's already enabled by default on a nav. Now, if I was working with a div or something like I did last time, I had to say make this a Flexbox, but Bootstrap has already done that. When I give it the nav class, it's already Flexbox enabled. So I can move things around like that. I could also, oops, just lost my spot. I could change this to be center. and now the items are centered within that. But most of the time, what I see used would be start, and then also between. So if you want your your items to be spaced out like that, or around. And it looks like that. Now it often looks better without the border, but I'm going to leave that there so you can just see where our space actually is in this nav. So other things we can do with navs, I'm not going to go over every single piece, but if you want to make a column nav, if you want to go vertical, all you do is give it flex column. So this is also something we saw in the last video. It's not particular or specific to navs. It's used on anything that is Flexbox enabled. So hopefully you can see here that using those Flexbox utilities, we can apply them to other components that are Flexbox enabled. So when we talk about the grid system, for example, we won't have to declare display flex. We'll just be able to use Flexbox right away. And there are many other components that are Flexbox enabled as well. Anyway, let's play around now with making something a column. So let's take this second one and just say flex column. Refresh the page, and now it turns into a column nav. But we could also say, instead of flex column, we could even do flex column, reverse. And now it's in the reverse order, going from bottom to top. Now what I want to show, I'll go back to flex column, is that we can also make a responsive nav. So maybe I want my nav to look as a row, spaced out like this, but then once we get to extra small, I want it to collapse to a column. Totally could do that. So to start, we would say flex column always, because there is no extra small size, but then say flex at small is a row. And if we refresh, it shouldn't change down here because it's a column at extra small, but we get to small and it turns into a row. And we could change the distribution. Let's say justify content center. Perfect. Now notice here, that looks fine. I think it looks good enough. When we get to this column, if you want this to be centered as well, what we're talking about is no longer justify content. Because remember, there's two two lines we have to care about. The main axis and the cross axis. So justify content works with the main axis. So this is a column going from top to bottom. Think of an arrow going down. The cross axis goes from left to right. So if I want them centered from left to right, I actually would use align items center. And refresh. There we go. We now have a centered nav as a column on the extra small size, and then we have a centered row on everything else. And that's pretty nice to be able to make that responsive like that and have control over exactly where that happens and how it happens. And if you wanted, you could actually have them go to the end instead, or the start, which is the default. Anyway, we have a lot of control. So there's more to navs around the actual UI of them. You can make, pills, which gives you this sort of active color. You can make tabs. That's relatively self-explanatory. You just add in nav-tabs. I guess, I can show one of those really quickly. Let's take this first nav and duplicate that again. But this time I'm going to say, we'll get rid of the justify content around. I'm going to say nav-tabs and refresh. Make this larger. It's kind of ugly with this border, but you can see that we have this tab going now. And actually, this is a good use case for some margin. So let's do margin top 5 on the nav. There we go. And get rid of the border. We don't need that anymore. And here are the tabs. So active is going to now actually do something. Unlike in these two, we have an active and they don't do anything. Okay, so the main point here was not to show navs necessarily. It was to show how we can take these Flexbox utilities we already learned about, which maybe some of that stuck. I know it was a lot, but if some of it stuck, remember things like justify content and align items, rows versus columns, all of that. We can apply it to individual components in Bootstrap 4, which we could not do at all. Those utilities didn't exist in Bootstrap 3. There was no Flexbox enabled components in Bootstrap 3. So this is all new. So I know it might take a while to sink in. You might need to rewatch things or play around a little bit, but it's really useful. And we'll see that coming up once we talk about the grid system.